A quick video to discuss some aspects of this last week that can be tied to themes we have already discussed in this class. To begin with, the effects of industrial capitalism on American life. At the beginning of this class, we mentioned some of the social and political problems that accompanied the transformation from an agrarian republic to an industrial democracy. After World War II, for 3 decades, many of the problems seem to have been resolved. From 1945 until 1973, the American economy witnessed remarkable growth. While this growth was not limited to the United States, the position of the US around 1950 was such that a British Prime Minister observed that the US was enjoying, quote, the greatest prosperity the world has ever known, end quote. If you recall our trip around the world in 1950 in search of civilization, well, really the largest world cities, the US had 6 in the top 20 most populous cities in the world in 1950. More than that, a series of other statistics paints an amazing portrait of American prosperity at the time. Around 1950, the US had only 7% of the world's population, but it had 42% of the world's income, 50% of the world's manufacturing output, 57% of the planet's steel, 43% of the electricity, 62% of the oil, 80% of the automobiles, and 75% of the world's gold supplies. Per capita income in the United States in mid-1949 was at $1,450, and this is much higher than the next most prosperous group of nations, Canada, Great Britain, New Zealand, Switzerland, and Sweden, at between $700 and $900. And yet, Americans, like their forebears, were not completely satisfied in their prosperity. A series of scholars and writers began to wonder whether suburbs and consumer goods were only blessings for American society. They were anxious about the social uniformity and conformity that seemed to accompany mass consumption. In 1880, social reformers were concerned that corporations might corrupt government. By 1970, reformers were concerned that corporations might corrupt souls. In popular music, a pithy summary of the attitude was expressed in Malvina Reynolds' song Little Boxes, composed in 1962. In 1963, a cover of the song by the folk singer Pete Seeger made the Billboard Top 100, and the term ticky-tacky became widespread. I've included a link to the song in additional resources. The sentiments of the song were echoed in much of the counterculture that emerged during the late 1960s and early 1970s. As you will see in President Johnson's speech, to fulfill these rights, the prosperity of the period also masked savage inequalities, particularly between white and black Americans. To illustrate this, I wanted to return to some other images from the beginning of the course. At the beginning of the course, I presented you with images showing the location of slaves as a percentage of the population in 1860. And then I showed you the location of African Americans as a percentage of the population in 2010. The similarities were striking. Now, the similarity is even more striking when one considers the so-called Great Migration of African Americans to northern cities after World War I and World War II. Why didn't these migrations substantially affect the pattern? The answer is persistent and enduring segregation. When African Americans moved to northern cities, they were, because of private prejudice, often supported by government policies such as zoning, kept to certain areas. This map from ProPublica, I've included a link in additional resources, illustrates the trend. The map shows the same kind of data from our previous maps, the location of African Americans as a percentage of the population. However, The presentation displays not only the national trend, but also the trend in a handful of those northern cities that were part of the Great Migration. In all of those cities, as you will see, the African American population was concentrated in particular areas. Despite sizable increases in population, they remained clustered due to private prejudice, such as restrictive covenants, abetted by governmental policies, local and federal. The areas swell, but there is none of the dispersion that one might expect, particularly as civil rights legislation was passed. Furthermore, even after the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, the trend has only changed slightly. African Americans are not quite so concentrated geographically, squished into certain areas, but segregation remains practically as strong. The separation between whites and blacks remains a measurable, demonstrable reality. This illustrates President Johnson's point. Equality before the law was not an immediately effective solution to the problems. A similar and even more troubling trend can be seen in education. I'll leave you to explore the map yourself in additional resources. So the point of all this is, as President Johnson suggested 50 years ago, to consider how much of the way we live today is still affected by the past, and what should we do about it, whether it be the problems associated with an increasingly unequal distribution of wealth brought on by industrialism or corporations, or the effects of past discrimination. Your answers will be your own, but the questions confront us all.